The topic tonight is living with wildfire in Santa Barbara. And wildfire is part of California in many ways. And we think about fire, especially when we're talking about losing our homes. And the best way, we're going to hit this first right up front, to protect your home from fire is from adapting from the house out rather than from the wildland in. And what that means is you start at the house and you figure out that's what you want to save. So how do you make the house as fire safe as possible? Look at the structure and the parts and the pieces, and then you start moving outward toward the vegetation. If you go the other way around, things don't work very well, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight primarily. So there's three real big issues about protecting your home from wildfire risk. And essentially they all boil down to being the most effective in terms of getting the fire-prone environment in a condition where you actually can protect your home, is trying to adapt to nature rather than forcing nature to try to adapt to us. And it just doesn't work, because when you try to do that, nature's always going to win. So location is a very important thing. There's a lot of places in California, and even in Santa Barbara here, that you put a house in a certain location, there's nothing that's going to protect it from a fire. It's in what you call a chimney or a fire alley, and those locations are just indefensible. So that's really the most important thing when it comes to a home in terms of fire risk. Second thing is building design. If you have a home that's got a shake shingle roof and you've got all sorts of flammable conditions around it, like a wood deck, and you just can't have those things. That's the next thing that's important. And finally, fuel management. And I say fuel management instead of vegetation management because we're talking about not just the vegetation, but the fences, the stacks of wood near the house, the play furniture, that kind of thing that all catches fire if it's not properly designed. So those are the three factors that are really the most important points when you're talking about trying to protect a home from ignition. And this picture here really demonstrates the key factor in why homes ignite. Most people have this sort of scenario in their mind where there's a big wall of flame that ignites the home. The wildland vegetation with its flames kind of marches into the house. And actually, most homes in all these wildfires in California ignite from embers that can travel up to 2 miles ahead of the fire front. In fact, a number of fires, especially down in 2007 in the Witch Creek fire in San Diego County, virtually no home, and there were more than 2,000 homes ignited and destroyed. Virtually no home was ignited by direct flame contact. It all had to do with embers that, like I said earlier, they travel up to 2 miles away from the fire front. So what are these embers landing on? Interestingly enough, they land on things you don't necessarily think are going to be ignitable. Let me explain how this happens. So we got a little design here that's going to be kind of causing some seasickness in some of you, but just bear with me. So we got the house there, we have vegetation, all of a sudden you got a fire front coming in. And there's a lot of wind, and that wind, what it's going to do, it's going to carry embers from the fire front. And watch what happens to that one ember. It gets into the tree and ends up into the attic, and that's how the house ignites. A lot of people, what they'll do is they'll clear a lot of the vegetation around their homes, and if you notice in that little graphic, the vegetation actually can act as a heat sink and an ember catcher to protect your home from fire. The notion of clearing vegetation completely around your house, actually what it does is creates a bowling alley for embers, and your home is the only target left. So there's a compromise here. We need to look at the details. That's what we're going to talk about here in a moment. This is a really beautiful series of palm trees in Santa Barbara County, and one night it had sort of an interesting little light in here. Actually, this was not an accent light. This was an ember that landed in this palm tree during the Halsey fire. And you can see what happens once the wind starts catching. These embers are like screaming killer bees, and these are the things that cause homes to burn. And unfortunately, most people don't understand it. They think it's the wildland vegetation which is the problem. The problem is any kind of thing that's going to burn. And these urban fuels, we call them, are the things that cause most homes to burn after the embers come in to ignite the vegetation. So palm trees especially are flammable and cause a lot of homes to go down when otherwise they would not have. And unfortunately, people love their palm trees so much, sometimes after big fires like this, they'll rebuild their house and they'll trim up their palm tree and get it ready for the next fire to do the same thing all over again. So we have to look at what's actually burning and what's actually causing the homes to ignite. It's not what we think. So urban fuels are important, and that means the vegetation, the cultivars, the palm trees, the stacks of wood, the fences. That's what's really causing the homes to go down. So let's talk about each one of these factors in detail. So location. Here's two homes that were burned in the Carlsbad fire in San Diego County earlier this year in 2014. And if you look at the picture, you've got a wall, basically a firewall around this home, these two homes, and you've got ice plant, you've got this defensible space, and you have the vegetation properly maintained. Well, what happened? Well, these homeowners did everything right, but guess what? The embers from the wildland vegetation way out where it was burning got into something and took these two homes out. And unfortunately, there wasn't a fire crew nearby because this house would have been very defensible. But again, it's the embers. Even though everything's done right, it's the ember that's causing the problem. Design is the second thing. If you take a look at this new development, it's right up against the wildland pretty much, but look at the homes here. You've got these eaves that are boxed in and very small, so embers can't get in there. You've got vents on top of the roofs. They're not those whirlybird things that actually act as vacuums that pull in embers into the attics. And then you have what you call Class A roofing, which is obviously not shake shingle, but it's stuff that's fire resistant. So the venting situation is really interesting because what happens sometimes is a fire front will come through, and again we talked about the embers were flying through, and they'll go into these vents, and this has happened in many fires where the fire department and the firefighters will follow the fire front as it moves through a development, and they think they've got everything taken care of, and then 3 or 4 hours later a whole bunch of homes start igniting from the kind of dirty fire, we call it, inside the vents and the attics. So these new design features are to prevent that. In the wildland, you can actually be near wildland areas without much danger because what happens is you do this fuel management around the homes. And the basic story is the same throughout jurisdictions in California. First of all, it's kind of like two zones. At the first 30 feet, you want to make sure there's nothing flammable around the house. It doesn't mean green lawn, it can mean rockscape or drought-resistant plants, but basically you just don't want anything that's going to really catch fire. And then the next 70 feet, you want to thin the vegetation. And if I had a wish, I'd purge the word clear or clearance, because what does that bring to mind? It brings to mind, well, you clear it all. Well, you don't. You go out into the wildland area if you're next to it and thin the vegetation, take all the deadwood out, trim up the trees, because you still want native habitat out there. First of all, because you're by the wildland because you enjoy nature. And second of all, these plants, like I said earlier, act as ember catchers and heat sinks. So they actually can protect the home if they're properly maintained and irrigated. And this is kind of what you're looking at here. In this situation, there are some non-native weeds on the ground that are going to be growing up. And a key factor here to prevent that from happening is you don't go out with goats or bulldozers or heavy equipment and disturb the soil, because native soil is undisturbed and properly contained in its own original condition. Weeds just don't grow out there, but they start coming in when you start disturbing the soil. So that's the one thing you want to try to avoid. And we're talking about basically 50% thinning. Now that doesn't mean 2 years later you thin the next 50%, which would eventually eliminate all vegetation. You just sort of keep it maintained in this percentage. So the studies have made this really clear that once you get the location situation ironed out and you get non-flammable materials, and then you do your maintenance around your home, you got a 95% chance of survival. There's nothing guaranteed in a wildfire, but if you do all the right things, the fire departments are trying to help people understand this, you really can do a lot to help protect your home. Here's a home, again, in San Diego County that was hit by the Witch Creek fire. And I want to bring this up because it shows some really good examples of what I'm talking about. You've got this zone here, zone 1, 30 feet. There's basically nothing flammable there. You don't have wooden patio furniture, which is actually enough to cause a home to ignite if it's near the house. And that umbrella there actually is not the best either. That could have ignited, but we'll sort of discount that at the moment. And then you have these trees, and these, by the way, happen to be eucalyptus trees. There's a lot of evil things said about eucalyptus trees. There's a number of species actually that are fine in terms of flammability if they're maintained properly. And these particular eucalyptus with the white trunks don't produce a lot of litter. And that's really the issue. You don't want to have plants that produce a lot of litter because people just don't have time to go out there and clean all that stuff up. So these trees are pretty good. A heat sink means the plant will absorb the heat instead of your home. And this is a magnolia tree here that actually is turned brown because of the heat, but the heat hit the tree instead of the house. So properly maintained plants and trees around a home can reduce fire risk. And that's something that is counterintuitive, that's not properly communicated usually in fire safety literature. If you take everything out, you actually can increase your fire risk. And interestingly enough, this house was saved by a fire crew because if you look at the roof there's some parts that have been taken out. Embers got up into the vent underneath some of the stone shingles and ignited the plywood underneath. And a fire crew happened to see smoke coming out of this roof, and they were able to get up there and chop it out and save the home. So you get these fire-resistant vents, and they're really pretty cheap. You retrofit your home, and you can do a significant dent in the amount of fire risk in a home. So to sum up here, here's a picture of the Halsey fire area in Santa Barbara after it passed through. And you can see it went through a lot of wildland area, but also this is urban stuff, most of this. And a lot of homes got lost in this fire. So most losses result from ember-caused ignition and burning urban fuels. So if you want to be an investor and put your money where it really is going to make the most difference, you put it in the wildland-urban interface, not out in the wildlands and try to create massive fuel breaks and grind up the habitat out there. That's not the problem. The problem is if you're going to spend money, the problem is right in there at the community level. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, sometimes people get carried away and they hear about this defensible space and they go overboard. And this is not what the fire departments are recommending, but some people take it too far. This is 300 feet of clearance. This house is probably one of the most vulnerable homes I've seen in a long time. They just cleared everything. Now what's going to happen now, you're going to have weeds and a lot of flammable vegetation coming back in here that's going to create a fire risk that was greater than it was before. And actually the state law on defensible space indicates that you can look at the entire environment, including the home, and take that into effect in terms of how much modification of vegetation you need to do. So if your home is a fire-safe home, you don't have to do much vegetation modification. It's in state law. And it makes sense because you don't want to do any more modification out there than necessary because it's going to cost money to maintain. So this is a picture I took in Pompeii, and this, you're wondering, what does this have to do with Santa Barbara? Well, if you know about the Roman civilization, a lot of those ancient civilizations, they fell apart in numerous ways, but one of the main reasons was because of overgrazing. And a lot of people love goats. They're cute. They think they're natural. But in fact, they have been responsible for some of the most devastating environmental damage, including destroying cropland fertility and topsoils in the Middle Eastern countries, as you can witness in pictures and whatnot when you see those areas now, that basically caused civilizations to collapse. Now, I'm not saying if we use goats to chew up the vegetation in Santa Barbara County, we're going to, Santa Barbara is going to collapse. But the point is, they can do a lot of damage, and there's a lot better ways to manage vegetation than going and throwing goats out on the landscape. Primarily because sometimes you can't control what they're going to do, and they compromise the soil. And here's a situation where there was way too much vegetation removed, and now this community has got this major erosion landslide issue to deal with. Another action people use to try to reduce fire risk, which actually increases, they go out in the wildland areas and they take these giant grinders and they grind up the habitat. And you can see this is right behind the community of Painted Cave up above Goleta. These giant masticator machines sit there and grind up the landscape. And I don't know if this is the type they used up there, but let me show you what the result is going to be. In the background, you see some shrubs that look like they've been artificially spaced. In fact, they have. They put a grinder out in here and space these shrubs in a way that they think is natural. Chaparral is naturally a very dense, impenetrable ecosystem. It's not supposed to be like a garden. It grows like what you see to the left there. Well, in the foreground, you see soil disturbed, and this is an area that was masticated, which is what they call it when they go out there and grind up the vegetation, disturbing the soil. The background area you see is all full of weeds. Well, this foreground is going to turn into the background, and what's the problem here? You've now introduced more flammable fuel in the form of these non-native annual weeds into a system that was flammable in the first place. Now you've created a kindling situation. So even though from a firefighter perspective, you're looking at this going, well, there's less fuel load there, I really don't like the word fuel in this context because it's actually habitat, and when you change names around, you forget what's really there. But when you actually look at what happens with a fire and when it's behaving, yes, it's going to burn not as hot, and the fuel load, habitat, is not as heavy. The fire is going to move through this a lot faster, a lot quicker, and it's more flammable. So in an attempt to reduce fuel risk, or fire risk rather, you've actually increased it by allowing the soil to be disturbed, which causes the introduction of these weeds. And this is again above the community of Painted Cave. So it's something to think about. So again, instead of spending money out here in the wildland, you want to put it right in the community and get people to retrofit their roofs, get the vents in, manage the vegetation around the community, and that would be much more effective than what's happened here. And interestingly enough, the research has verified this. When a group of homes in the thousands have been studied in California in the last 20 years in terms of fires, ironically, homes burn more frequently when they were surrounded by this kind of situation than they were by native natural vegetation like chaparral. It sounds counterintuitive, but again, this is where the science is, and we have to look to the science to make our decisions. And coming up to fuel breaks and that kind of thing, this is the Windy Ridge fuel break right above Goleta. It's a pretty egregious scar, I believe, on the landscape that is not necessary, and it isn't necessarily productive. And I'll tell you why. In the station fire in Los Angeles a few years ago, there was virtually a fuel break on every ridge, and the fire just jumped over every one of them. And so what do these fuel breaks do? What's their function? Well, here's what the research has shown us. Fuel breaks work, but only if they're in strategic locations and only if a fire crew is on the break. And you can use these fire breaks to conduct what you call a backfire. But generally speaking, a lot of these places, you're not going to put a fire crew up there. It's too dangerous. And so what we have to really start doing is saying to ourselves, okay, is this fuel break a strategic location that's really going to be utilized if a fire comes in this direction? And it needs to be looked at critically, because the money that's used on these fuel breaks, we already know could be much more effective if it was used directly around communities. All right, so that sort of focuses on the community flammability issue. And once you've got that ironed out, what's really important is you turn into the area that you actually live in, and you want to find out, where exactly do we live and why is it so flammable? Because in order to understand where you are and to enjoy your life, actually, you really need to know the local habitat and what's going on out there. And once you do, then answers will come that may not come otherwise in terms of other questions. So when you look at the Los Padres National Forest, where are the trees? The 4 national forests in Southern California, for the most part, are shrublands. So I've come up with this new phrase. It actually should be the Los Padres National Chaparral Recreation Area, because that's really what's out there. And when things aren't named properly, they get dismissed or not known. And that's why chaparral is relatively an unknown entity, because people don't really know what it is. So it suffers an identity problem. It's sort of the ecosystem in between. And everybody knows what forests are, what grasslands are, primarily because that's where we used to get timber and that's where we raise our cows. It's a monetary issue. But there's this great ecosystem in between called the shrublands, which really is where most of the habitat is in North America, is in all the shrubs underneath the trees and between the grasses and all of that. And our favorite chaparral shrubland is the chaparral in Southern California, and it's in every single county in the state. There's even some down there in Imperial County. The map doesn't really show that, but if you're going to have a state ecosystem, it would be chaparral. So again, it's the most extensive ecosystem in California. So it's equivalent to meadow, forest, estuary, chaparral. Chaparral is a particular habitat type. And as I mentioned earlier, there's 4 national forests that protect these things, and we're going to try to change this whole idea of what a forest is to help people understand what's really out there. So if you want a definition, it's a unique plant community characterized by 3 things. Drought-hardy shrubs. There just aren't any trees. There's a few trees from time to time, but for the most part, it's shrubs. A Mediterranean-type climate, which means hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, and infrequent crown fires, which I'll explain what that is in a minute, but infrequent's the key phrase here. They don't come through very often. And that's wanted to let you know this is not Chaparral. This is actually a TV show. I don't know how many people remember this, but the show is filmed in Tucson. Actually, there's some chaparral in the Catalina Mountains behind Tucson, but I don't think they ever shot an episode up there. So there's 5 basic things we need to know about this environment we live in that we want to adapt to. And the first one is, we enjoy a Mediterranean type climate. It's not a desert. And whenever you hear people say this, and people say this all the time, deserts have 3 to 4 to 5 inches of rainfall a year. Depending on where you are in Southern California, you get anywhere from 12 to 30 to 35. So it's not a desert. It's a Mediterranean type climate. And here are all the Mediterranean type climates in the world. Around the Mediterranean, which is what it's named for, South Africa, Central Chile, and southwestern Australia, in California. And fortunately, because of the 4 national forests in Southern California, we're the best preserved Mediterranean climate region in the world. And this kind of tells you why the climate is the way it is. If you look at this is a rainfall graph, and it shows you where all the rainfall falls. And the higher rainfall is obviously San Francisco as you go north, and the least is in San Diego. But what starts happening is you just don't get any rain in the summer. This is the opposite of what you have like in some place weird like Indiana. Not that Indiana is weird, but weather-wise for us it is. And so in California, for the most part, spring starts with the first rain in October, November. And that goes through December, January, February, March. And then the next season is fall, lasts about 2 weeks in June. And then the third season is drought, which lasts anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5, 6 months. And it's been increasing lately because of climate change. But this is a very different climate than most of the world deals with. So are there seasons in the chaparral? Well, sure, you just have to get out of your car and look around. This phrase, April showers bring May flowers, is just not appropriate for us. So I've kind of scratched this one. I've made this one up here. You can use this if you talk to people about the chaparral and claim it your own if you like. Winter rainy days bring February bouquets. That's what happens here. So while they're shoveling snow in New York, we're looking at flowers. Number 2, chaparral is a diverse, rich ecosystem. It's not all the same. In Santa Barbara, there's a whole bunch of kinds of chaparral. There's manzanita chaparral, there's mixed chaparral, there's a special type called maritime chaparral. And so once you start looking at things and start noticing there are differences, it's really a wonderful ecosystem to study. And these 7 here that I've listed are sort of the basic types. And if you notice, they're named mostly after plants. And for example, redshank chaparral, which is here, and chamise chaparral, those chaparral types are almost 90% that one plant, which is very unusual. All right, so there's 6 essential shrubberies you have to know if you wanted to impress your friends who come in from back east and take them on a hike. There's really only 6 shrubs you kind of need to know, and you probably know this one. This is manzanita. And here's a common one you probably know. Some people call this lilac. It's actually called ceanothus. And then we have the most common shrub in California west of the Sierras. This is called chamise. Some people call it greasewood. That's kind of a pejorative name, so we don't want to use that one. Then this is the scrub oak, very low-statured oak. Then we have this one that's it's a wonderful plant because these little awns that come off the seeds sparkle during the summer months, and that's how you can find these plants. They kind of have this interesting sheen. That's mountain mahogany. And the final one you don't see very often here. You see a lot of it in Angeles National Forest and San Bernardino, but there's some up here. This is called silk tasselbush. So now if you know all these plants, all of a sudden what you'll start to discover is there's plants out there that don't look like this, and then you'll know what you don't know. And the wonderful thing about science and learning is it not only helps you learn things, but it makes you realize there's things out there you don't know, and that's what's so interesting. So it's like bird watching. Once you know a few birds, then you find out there's a bird there that you don't know, and that spurs you on to more learning, which is actually pretty fun. There's also some very pushy animals, and they're pushy because there's not a lot of resources in the chaparral scattered about. They're very concentrated. So these animals have very, very specific territories. This is one of my favorite birds. It's a wren tit, has this great little call. It has this little kind of bouncing ping pong ball call. It goes like this. And you should try that right now. If you can't whistle, you should hum. If you're good at it, you can be a good wren tit. So these little guys are really wonderful. They live to be 8 to 9 years old. They have territories about an acre, acre and a half, and And they really are the first bird you hear at dusk, and the last bird you hear at dusk, and the first bird you hear in the morning in the chaparral. There's also some rodents out there. This is the big-eared wood rat. They make these big piles of sticks, and they're really pretty fun to find because you can find all sorts of fun little objects there sometimes. That's a matriarchal society. The female kind of runs a roost, and then after the babies are born, they kind of kick the boys out after about 5 to 6 months, and they kind of roam the chaparral with these nasty attitudes. And sometimes they'll meet some snakes and predators, but for the most part, they take care of themselves. Now, one of the animals that used to be in the chaparral that is no more, it was the dominant animal in the chaparral. They would make these tunnels in order to get through the thick shrubbery. And I would hate to be at the entrance of one of these things or at the end of one and come up to, yes, the California grizzly bear. Its preferred habitat was the chaparral, and they used to dine on beach whales down at the beach, and Native Americans were really quite terrified of them. They really owned this region. They had this characteristic hump. They were the biggest, most gregarious grizzly bears on the planet. After the Spaniards got here, there were so many cattle that the bears were able to, the population exploded, and they would roam in packs of 10 to 20 sometimes. It must have been something else. Unfortunately, they're extinct now. The last one was killed in Central and Southern California in 1908 in the Santa Ana Mountains behind Santa Ana up there. He was shot by a hunter that was disturbed that it was disturbing his honey pots up there with the beehives. But I'm convinced today there's still gold grizzly bear trails out in the chaparral. And whether this was one or not, I don't know. But some of these old growth stands of chaparral that are maybe 125, 150 years old, there's probably still grizzly bear trails out there. Now, the only really big predator we have anymore out in the chaparral is the cougar. There's quite a few of those out there, fortunately, because we've protected them now. And there also used to be a very interesting cat called a jaguar. They used to be all over the place. And the reason I'm bringing these animals up is because we've lost a tremendous amount of biodiversity in the chaparral, primarily because of the way we are. And that's sort of a reminder to tell you that it's important to protect what's left. And I'll tell you why. Because we protected what's left, because of the National Forest or National Chaparral Recreation Areas, we are able to protect this animal, the California condor. They are still around because we were able to release them into wildland areas, which are predominantly chaparral. So this habitat is essential to preserving the biodiversity of California. All right, getting back to fire here. This is sort of something that most people, it's counterintuitive what you hear. Chaparral can be eliminated by the wrong kind of fire. It's not made to burn. Here's a place right behind my house, actually, in Southern California that got hit by the 2007 Witch Creek fire. That's my son back there. And just to give you a graphic about how it changed, I'll do this again so you can see it and follow through. That manzanita there in the background actually is still there, but it's just a stick. So same kid, just 2.5 years older. This looks like a devastated landscape, and it does really pull the heartstrings. But I'm not worried about this landscape because the last time it burned was about 100 years ago. So it's going to come back beautifully. Chaparral fires, in order for them to be natural and do what they need to do, they're hot, they're intense, and they leave large areas of moonscapes. It's not unnatural. This is the way it's supposed to be. But the problem now is we're having so many fires coming so close together that it's causing the environment to really get compromised. So this whole area got burned in 1970. This is in San Diego County. And the middle area got burned again in 2001. And look at the lower right-hand corner. That got burned again in 2003. So the time period between those last two fires was only 2 years. So what's going on? Well, there's not enough time for the chaparral to recover within 2 years. And so the plants can't resprout. There's no seeds. And so something's got to fill the void, and if you can see, you guessed it, it's non-native weeds, which now has created a more flammable environment than the chaparral was. So this is happening throughout Southern California. It's happened throughout the Central Coast here in the Buellton, San Luis Obispo area, which was facilitated also by ranching. Huge areas of landscape have been what we call type converted. Chaparral has been eliminated and has been replaced by weeds. The essential thing here is this has all been caused by human population growth. So you look at this graph, the top graph is human population growth in California, and the lower graph is fire frequency. So over the last 100 years, there's been more fires on the landscape than Southern California and Central California landscapes can really tolerate. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. These color areas are the Los Padres National Forest. And essentially all the hot colors, the yellows, the oranges, and the reds, those are areas that have more fire than are naturally supposed to come along. So those areas are at risk of type conversion. And you can see it's most of the front country there behind Santa Barbara. The blue areas are where the conifers are for the most part, and some of those areas may have missed some fire cycles. So that's the story you always hear, that fire suppression has suppressed fires, and the landscape's getting clogged with vegetation and fuel, which again, I would remind you is actually habitat that animals live in. That story may be valid in terms of missed fire cycles in those blue areas, but again, for the most part, the Los Padres is really at risk of type conversion in many areas, very similar to the southern national forests. And another issue that is layering another risk on top of this is climate change. So if you look at the current scenario there on the left, and look at the orange is what I want you to focus on. We don't know whether it's going to get wet or dry. It looks like it's getting drier. So look how the colors of the oranges have changed in the maps. So we're probably going to lose 50% of our shrubland ecosystem by doing nothing, mainly because of climate change if predictions pan out. So what's that mean? Well, when we go out in the landscape and we try to do modification for fire risk reduction, we got to realize we can't be thinking about what we've been doing the last 20, 30, 50 years. We've got to think what's going to be happening in the next 100 years. And that's really the critical issue. We have to plan ahead. We can't be using old paradigms to judge how we're going to manage the landscape, because if we do, we're just going to add to the loss that's already going to be coming anyway. So it's best to think of chaparral as adapted to particular fire patterns, not fire per se. And there's a whole host of wonderful plants out there that have adapted to the natural fire regime in chaparral, which is basically a fire every 50 to 150 plus years. You get below that, especially under 20 years, and you're dealing with a situation where the system cannot survive. Here's the Zaka fire in 2007, burned a huge landscape. And a lot of people said, well, it was because it was dense. It was unnaturally thick with vegetation. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's what chaparral is. It's an intense and frequently burned landscape with huge crown fires. Now, what exactly is a crown fire? So this one little point here I wanted to make before we move on. A lot of people blame firefighters for putting out fires, which causes these supposedly unnatural levels of vegetation, and environmentalists because they sue to prevent firefighting treatments from happening. That just isn't true. There have always been big fires in Southern California and Central California, and there will always be big fires. It's just the nature of the landscape, and we really have had nothing to do with it. What we have had to do with is increasing the number of fires and the cause. We're causing them now. It's not the natural environment. So getting back to this crown fire issue. So up there on the right, we have a surface fire regime, and on the left, we have a crown fire regime. Now, what does this mean? Surface fire regimes are when there's little fires caused by lightnings that burn out some of the vegetation. This is the story you always hear. And that works in some forests, but it doesn't work in all of them. Crown fire regimes are when the fire comes through and takes everything out. That's another natural pattern. You even find that in forests. The Yellowstone fires in '88, huge acreages of forests were burned. Those were lodgepole pine forests. The natural fire return interval for those forests is anywhere from 150 to 300 years, depending on elevation. So there's no impact of fire suppression or anything like that has caused all this vegetation to grow. It's just, plants grow, and in some areas they burn, in some areas they don't. So we have to understand every area has its own fire regime, and the plants have adapted to it accordingly. We don't all live in ponderosa pine forests that have little lightning-caused fires like they do in Arizona. So what's really natural? Well, there's approximately 20 or so lightning fires in the Los Padres National Forest in the southern portion over a 10-year period. That's just not enough lightning to cause these little fires that supposedly are supposed to take out the vegetation and keep fires small. And what about Native Americans? Well, there's been a lot of talk about, we just did what the Native Americans did. We burned the landscape regularly. Well, first of all, we don't really know how much the Native Americans burned. Second of all, they weren't here for in significant numbers to have much impact until about 5,000 years ago. And the question is, well, what happened before that? And I always wonder, this place must have been a disaster before humans got here to fix it. Because humans include Native Americans, and they modified their environment for the same reason we do. They needed to exploit it to survive. So we don't need to look back, we need to look forward, because now there's more people on the landscape, the climate's changing, and you've got huge impacts from climate change. So the last thing here I want to mention, and I kind of sprinkled this throughout my presentation, but old growth chaparral really is a beautiful, rare natural resource. It does not need to burn. This system can survive for centuries, being just incredibly immune with man's need is with trunks the size of your waist. And it's not brush. It's not something that needs to be mitigated. It's not a fire hazard if it's not near your home. It's really a beautiful environment. So I just want to leave you with the fact that out there in the landscape, there's some magnificent old growth chaparral that's slowly disappearing because there are too many fires on the landscape itself. So to summarize, there's three main points here I want to help you remember. Like I just said, chaparral is a really beautiful natural resource that's being threatened by climate change and too much fire. And it's coming from the south. So if you want to see what Santa Barbara County may be looking like in 100 years, check out Riverside County and San Diego County in the east part of the county and see how much type conversion there is. Even actually look up in San Luis Obispo area and see how much of these shrublands have been lost. Secondly, preparation, embers, and urban fuels. Money spent at the WUI, which is the wildland-urban interface, is the most effective way to reduce loss from wildfires. So if you're going to spend money, it's got to be around the homes and around the communities themselves. This includes properly managed fuel breaks around the communities, not out in the wildland. And finally, it is best to adapt to nature than trying to force nature to adapt to us, because if we try to force it, it's not going to work. It's just like earthquakes. You don't try to stop earthquakes. You retrofit buildings to survive them. The same thing with fire. You don't try to stop fires. It's kind of an old model. What we need to do is realize they're going to keep coming no matter what we do, but what we can do is create communities that are fire safe by using the science and trying to adapt to the environment that we live in.